Asymmetric games are games where each player has access to a different character or faction or deck and so on, access to different powers and abilities than the other players. I find these kinds of games really interesting, and I want to tell you some properties that are great about asymmetric games. Before we get deep into any game design topics, there's something really simple that I want to say right at the top, and that is that there's a fun factor that comes with playing asymmetric games. There's a fun factor that has to do with identifying with the character that you're playing. And it could be superficial. Maybe you like the character's name or appearance or vibe, but I don't mean just that. There's also a connection you can have with the gameplay of a character. Maybe a certain character is a rushdown character and you really like that, or is a very careful, control-y character, or is maybe difficult to play, but if you can master them, then you can do some really powerful things, and maybe that appeals to you. So you can have a connection to the different gameplay styles or to the surface level of a character. And not just a character, it works for a side or a faction like a race in StarCraft just as well. Even without any of the thinky things that I'm going to go over next, this one simple property that I've told you so far is enough that it can often make symmetric games kind of fall flat for me compared to asymmetric games where I can pick a character or side. In order to discuss some of the great properties of asymmetric games, I want to start by asking 3 questions about them. The first question is about complexity. So how much do you need to learn to start playing this type of game? The second question is, if you are playing this type of game, what kind of environment are you playing in when you play against other players? And the third question is, what kind of dynamics during gameplay can we expect to see in an asymmetric game that we don't see in a symmetric game? The first question I raised is, how much do you have to learn to play an asymmetric game? And I mean, compared to if it was a symmetric game. And the answer is about the same. That answer might be really obvious or really surprising and confusing depending on your background of if you've played a lot of these types of games or not. So let's think of an example. I'll use Street Fighter, but there's nothing special about it. We could really use just about any asymmetric game. Suppose that the game has 20 different characters. So how much do you have to learn to play Street Fighter? And the answer is 1 character. I mean, it's totally normal to learn 1 character. It's not like you have to play all 20 or something. That would be very unusual. So the unit of complexity here in order to play the game is to learn 1 character. And that isn't really more complicated than if this were a symmetric game. Well, let's think about if it was a symmetric game. Let's say we had a Street Fighter game and it has 20 different characters and we wanted to make a symmetric game out of that. Well, one way to do that would be to just delete 19 of the characters. So there's only 1 left, and I play that character, you play that character, everyone plays it. So in that case, I didn't change the complexity of learning the game, really. I still have to learn 1 character. I can anticipate that you might have 2 questions that you want to raise about that example. One of them is, maybe that's not the right way to make this game symmetric. I'll give you another way to do it. You have 20 characters, but let's make a new character that has all of the moves of all the characters. Then we can delete all those other characters. So you only play this 1 super character. And now you're thinking, I've got you. The complexity of having to learn this game is so huge. Yeah, you could do that, but it's not really a reasonable thing to do, because what you've done is you've made the complexity of playing this game like way too much. So if we're comparing a symmetric and asymmetric game, this is just not generally how it would be done. We wouldn't be talking about a symmetric game that was so jam-packed full of stuff that it was like 20 times more complicated than learning 1 character in an asymmetric game. No, it's not going to be like that. Learning 1 character in an asymmetric game is usually very similar to just learning the only character in a symmetric game. Another objection you might have is that in the asymmetric game, the Street Fighter that has 20 characters or whatever, you might be thinking, well, it takes 1 unit of complexity for me to learn 1 character. Sure, but don't I have to learn all 20? Isn't it actually 20 units just to play the game? Because even if I only select 1 character, I have to play against all of those other ones. Now that is definitely incorrect. And if you've played these types of games, I'm sure that you know it's incorrect. It doesn't bear any resemblance to reality, even at the highest level of tournament play. Learning to play as a character or side or faction or something is generally very difficult. There's a lot that goes into that. Learning to play against someone else doing that is a tiny microscopic thing in comparison. It is totally normal, even for pro players at the highest level, to be able to play only one character and to be excellent at playing against all those other characters, sure, but to have no chance of them actually being able to select all of those other characters and play them competently. No way. It's because there's so much that you have to know in order to actually control and execute and do all the strategy and know all the nuances of how to create setups that you've got to do for every kind of character. But when you play against another character, it's just a completely different experience. You're like, oh, they want to throw a lot of fireballs and I need a counter to that. Or in an RTS, though, they want to turtle a lot. And so I need ways to pierce a specific couple things in their defense. I'll give another example that I hope illustrates the point of this question, and that is Overwatch. Overwatch has like 40 characters. That's a lot of characters. So think of all the things that you would have to master if we just threw all of that into a symmetric game like Quake. So imagine if in Quake, you're going around the level and there's like 40 different weapons that you could pick up and you have to know how to use all of them just in case you do. And that's not enough. There's like 100 or way more than 100 different special moves laying around that you could pick up because that's what the sum total of all the Overwatch characters have. That's a crazy amount of complexity to put in a symmetric game, and the actual game of Quake 3 has 9 weapons in total. So you have to learn to use 9 different weapons because you might encounter those pickups in the level. If you want to play an Overwatch character, then what do you have to learn? You have fire, alt fire, 2 special abilities, maybe 3, and an ultimate. So that's like 6 moves or maybe 7 for some characters. It's a pretty reasonable amount. So the answer to my first question of how much do you need to learn to play an asymmetric game is really close to the same amount you'd have to learn in a symmetric game with just a tiny bit more about matchups. The second question I raised is what kind of environment do you play in when you play an asymmetric game against other players? And the answer is that you get to play in a generally pretty richly diverse environment with a lot of interesting things going on. In the Street Fighter example, you only had to learn 1 unit of complexity, 1 character, but you got to participate in a system that has the complexity of 20 different characters. You just don't have to actually control all of them yourself, but you still get the benefit of all of those interesting interactions and variety. In Overwatch, likewise, your character has 6 or 7 abilities or something like that, but you get to participate in the rich tapestry that has so much more. It has over 100 abilities and has 40 different weapons, each with a different fire and alt fire mechanic to them. So much more than just the 9 weapons in Quake. And I'm not trying to say that Quake 3 is a bad game. I don't think that at all. What I'm saying is that when you play Overwatch, even though you might only learn 1 character, you are participating in a richly diverse environment of many different weapons and special moves that far exceed the number of interactions that are in Quake. And in a fighting game like Street Fighter, you are also participating in a rich environment with way more dynamics, interactions, and mechanics than could ever be in a 1-character fighting game that only had a mirror match. And that brings me to the concept of matchups. A game that has 20 different characters has 210 different matchups. That's so much to explore and so much fun to be found. So you can see how if someone is used to 200 something matchups, that suggesting a game with just 1 matchup sounds like maybe not enough. The third question I raised is, what are some dynamics that we expect to find in an asymmetric game that we don't expect to find in a symmetric game? And this concept of matchups is very relevant again. By the way, when I say matchup, I mean like Ken versus Ryu is a different matchup than Ken versus Blanca. I mentioned that a game with 20 characters has 210 matchups. Well, 20 of those matchups are mirror matchups, meaning same character against same character, and the other 190 are different character versus different character. But the mirror matchups, the 20 where it's same character versus same character, are notoriously the least interesting matchups in an asymmetric game. I don't think that's an accident. Let's think of one example matchup that kind of illustrates it. So in Street Fighter, Ryu versus Zangief. Ryu has a fireball. He wants to keep Zangief away. Zangief does not have any projectiles, and he deals all of his damage from close with a big throw. So he just wants to get close and do that big move as much as he can. These characters have completely different, asymmetric, you could say, goals from each other. And the dynamic, the way that this match plays out, is completely different than many other matchups. This dynamic where one character really wants to get close or get in, as grapplers say, and the other wants to keep him away or zone him out, is a genuinely interesting and fun dynamic to participate in. This dynamic stems directly from these characters having completely different moves with different goals. Earlier, I had us imagine that we transformed an asymmetric Street Fighter into a symmetric game to see what we ended up with. Well, if we do it in the way where we just cut all the characters except for one, then clearly we're not going to end up with this Ryu versus Zangief dynamic where one character wants to get in and the other doesn't. But we also don't end up with that dynamic if we do it the other way, where we create one super character that has all the moves, a character that has a fireball that can keep someone away and also has a big throw like Zangief has. If I can play as that character and you are playing as that character, we don't have the dynamic of one of us really trying to get in and the other really trying to zone us out, because either of us can kind of do anything. So that is a dynamic that gets lost when you don't have asymmetric play anymore. And that's just one of dozens or hundreds or something. There's so many dynamics that exist precisely because of this asymmetry. When you take out all those asymmetric strengths and weaknesses of different characters, you really take out the texture of the dynamics and you're left with just mirror matches. So in summary, in order to play an asymmetric game, you only have to learn about the same amount as you would have to in a symmetric game, or maybe just a little bit more, and yet you get to participate in the richly diverse environment of all of this complexity of interaction, a lot of which you don't have to worry about controlling yourself. And you get access to a large set of dynamics that will arise during gameplay that wouldn't really arise if it were a symmetric game. I want to give a couple counterexamples to this. They're not really counterexamples, though. I think they're just footnotes. The footnotes are for the first-person shooter Overwatch, which I already talked about, and the card game Codex. Overwatch is an asymmetric game. You really do pick a character with different moves and powers than the opponent might be picking, and it really does have the properties that I've already talked about. The footnote here that makes Overwatch a little bit different, though, is that you can change which character you are during gameplay. Over the course of a match, you can change from one character to another if you want to. And this isn't just a technicality. It's something that really is part of the gameplay. If the opponent's team composition is really strong versus yours, then yeah, you should switch. You should switch to some other character that makes more sense to play against the other team. In most asymmetric games, it really is reasonable to play just one character. In Overwatch, I think the developers expect you to play a little bit more. I'm not actually sure how many. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? I don't know. 2 or 3 maybe they expect you to play. And because this is part of the game, it means that the Overwatch developers have a choice. So which is it? Is it that each character is really full of about the most complexity they could ask the player to learn, and so when you have to learn to play 2 or 3 or 4, you get overloaded? Is that the idea? Or is it that each character is well below that kind of max limit so that learning 2 or 3 or 4 is still reasonable? And it's clear to me that the second one is what they're going for. There is a little bit of irony in that the Overwatch characters are more complicated than a character often is in the first-person shooter genre, but they're still nowhere near the complexity of a character or a side in most other asymmetric games. So I think, at least in my opinion, it is totally reasonable to learn to play a few different Overwatch characters. If each Overwatch character were as complicated to learn as a Guilty Gear character or a Tekken character, I think that would not go over well in Overwatch where you can switch characters. So it makes sense that they turn the knob down to the level that it's at. Another footnote is the card game Codex. Codex, like Overwatch, is definitely an asymmetric game. In Codex, you pick a faction, and each faction's cards have totally different powers and strengths and weaknesses from the other factions. So Codex really does have all the great properties that asymmetric games have in general. But there is one more detail, something that might be worth thinking about if you're making an asymmetric game. Let's do a thought experiment here and delete all the factions of Codex except for one, so that all we're left with is a mirror match. So let's say the red faction is the only faction left. This imaginary version of Codex with just the mirror match actually has a little bit wider range of dynamics than a mirror match usually has. The reason that mirror matches, the kind of match where we both have the same character or side, tend to be the least interesting ones in asymmetric games is because we have the same strengths and weaknesses. But in this example of you're playing the red faction in Codex and I'm playing the red faction in Codex, we don't actually have the same strengths and weaknesses as the game plays out. In Codex, you're building your deck as you play. You're choosing which heroes to focus on and which of their spells to even put in your deck. There's also a tech tree that can go this way or that. So you are committing to having certain strengths and certain weaknesses over the course of the game that are very likely to be different than the ones the opponent chooses. So even over the course of this mirror match, you end up with kind of a pseudo asymmetry. But there's a couple things I want to point out about that. That is a really cool property, and I think it's a plus of the game, but there's a limit to how far that goes. If we were to add back in another faction, let's say the blue faction, we are getting a huge variety of new dynamics. The blue faction plays completely differently, and it's way more control-y, whereas the red faction, even though it does have different ways it can go, they're kind of different methods of offense. Maybe you're thinking, what about this? Let's take all the blue cards and make them red and then put them in the red faction. Then even in the red mirror match, there's just so many more dynamics. And yeah, you'd be right. We could keep doing that for all the other factions. We could just give you one super faction and that's all anyone plays, but it would be hundreds and hundreds of more cards to think about during gameplay each game. And it's just way too much. The actual real version of Codex is already at the kind of limit of complexity that we should expect of players. And then the second caveat comes from trying to use this to your advantage on a new design. So if Codex Red versus Red has managed to get a bit of pseudo asymmetry in there, then can you do that in your game? Well, it might be tough. What if your game was something like Street Fighter or something like Overwatch? Well, in those games, your character just is what it is. You don't build it over the course of the game and make decisions where you commit it to have certain advantages and disadvantages. If those games did work like that, they would be completely different. They might even feel like a different genre. So this technique is not widely applicable. I just thought it was worthwhile, at least as a footnote, to point out that you can squeeze a little bit more pseudo asymmetry out of a game if you can kind of build your character over the course of the game. Even then, though, such a game sounds a lot more fun if you add a bunch more characters into the mix. Another footnote about Codex is that, unfortunately, it is out of print right now. But I have been working on a great new version of Codex, which you can play right now on my Patreon. I can't afford the artwork that it needs right now, so you'd be helping get it made if you choose to support it there. Oh, and let me know what your favorite asymmetric games are in the comments.